Hey guys, Alex here. Now last week I showed you the setup of my tiny little 900ml Pico tank in which I'm going to be keeping Michael and his 6 or 7 little Mahano anemone friends. And you guys seem to love that video, it went down really well in the comment section. So today what I'm going to do is show you some of the mods I've had to make to this pretty basic 40-pound Algae E-tank to make it run and tick over smoothly. And I'll also talk you through what my maintenance regime is likely to involve to keep this tank ticking over, looking clean and keeping Michael and his mates healthy. So with that being said then, let's get stuck in. Now because this costs just £40, I don't think the manufacturer will hate me too much if I say that it was built to a budget. And straight out of the gate, I needed to make an adjustment to the plumbing, otherwise it wouldn't have worked and it would just be spilling water all over the place. Now on any tank with a sump, you need a pipe to go from the return pump all the way up to the main tank, and it needs to go through a tight fitting hole so water doesn't spill out the side of the pipe. But on this tank, apparently they didn't think about that, so the pipe that goes from the return pump to the display tank just sits loosely in a hole, and that means that if I'd have turned it on without doing anything about it, it just would have spilled water out the side that would have dribbled out here onto my nice little shelf here. Now fortunately the pipe had a bit of a flat spot, which meant I could super glue it to the bottom of the display tank, which meant it covered up the entirety of the hole. And that, along with a little bit of super glue at the top as well, created a watertight seal that means nothing is going to spill out of here. So that's the first problem that I encountered immediately after opening the box, and I managed to fix it quite easily. The second problem with the plumbing came when I turned it on for the first time. Now the pump is really tiny and not very powerful, but apparently it is too strong for this tank. Out of the box, when you turn it off and then back on again, the water squirts up right up here really fast and then starts spilling out over the top. Now it does settle down after, I don't know, 10 or 15 seconds by the time the water has caught up with it, but as soon as you turn it on, you get water squirting out the top and again spilling out over the side. And I had to do 2 fixes to put that right. Now this tank actually came with a little sponge that you can use as a filter, but what I did instead was cut it up into a tiny little bit and I stuffed it down the overflow box to block that up. And that meant that when the water came up from the pump, it would hit the sponge so it doesn't squirt up there and then gently push up until it went over the edge and back into the main tank. So that was first problem sorted. Now in theory there is a chance that that sponge will clog up over time and cause issues with water going from the sump to the main display tank, but I think the chances are pretty likely and I'm not expecting a massive amount of detritus, so that should be alright. However, even with the sponge holding the pump back, I still found that I was getting water right to the very top here that looked like it could spill out any minute because the pump is still quite powerful and pushes water right up into the corner. Now the tank comes with all sorts of little bits of plastic that you're supposed to put in the plumbing in the overflow box, but I found they just restricted flow massively and they didn't actually do any good. So I utilised one such piece that I super glued into the top corner of the tank to stop the water spraying up directly, and now it dissipates really evenly. It goes straight up from the return pump and then straight out across the top of the tank. So problem solved, I now have all my plumbing fixed, right? Well, not quite. There was one last thing I had to fix. You can probably hear this gently bubbling away in the background because unsurprisingly, the downflow isn't absolutely silent. I don't have a valve so I can't tune it, so it does make a little bit of noise, but that doesn't really bother me. However, when I first set it up, I did find that there was a massive water trickling sound as the water went from the bottom of the main tank into the sump. So the water level in the sump is around here, and I found that there was just a trickling noise that made me want to pee all day long. So what I did was put a sponge inside the sump just above the water level to catch the water dripping down, and that meant that there was no splashing noise, and now the tank is back to a nice quiet-ish sound. The reason it still makes some noise is because it doesn't create a complete siphon, so you get kind of air drawn in and it makes bubbles as it goes down. Now I could fix that, but it'll be a little bit fiddly, and to be honest, it's quiet enough, so I think I'm just going to leave it as it is and call that a day. And while that means the plumbing is now acceptably quiet, there was still a little tiny bit of vibration from the pump, even though it's absolutely minute. So I went and bought some felt furniture feet and glued them to each corner of the tank to dampen some of the vibrations. Now to be fair, if you listen really closely, you can still hear the pump running, but it's really quiet and there are no vibrations, and it was the vibrations that were doing my head in, so I'm happy with that now. However, while that meant I was happy with the noise and the plumbing, there were still 2 last things I needed to fix. Now while it does have a lid to prevent evaporation, the centre of the lid, right below the light, does have a gaping hole, which means that with a tiny little bit of surface water movement at the top, I was likely to lose some fresh water to evaporation, which would mean my salinity would spike and I'd have to replace that with fresh water, and there's no way I'm going to be topping this off every couple of days. It's far too much effort for what is supposed to be a tank that looks after itself. So I simply cut out a bit of clear plastic, put it over the hole, and now that is blocked up. So I should lose pretty much zero water to evaporation, and while I'm doing weekly water changes as well, that should keep my salinity nice and stable. And the final mod I made was an aesthetic one. Straight out of the box, the light comes with a USB cable that goes directly out sideways and looks really messy. Given this tank is so tiny, anything that sticks out even a tiny little bit really looks a bit daft, so that had to go, and in its place I bought a 90-degree USB cable that is a lot more subtle and pretty much stays out of the way, and I think it looks quite sleek. So those are the modifications I've made. What about maintenance? Well, as I showed in the video before, I will be doing water changes with syringes, and what I didn't show though is that I have two syringes. I'm going to be using one to remove water and then one to add in new water. And the reason I've got that is because I don't want to risk contamination. So if I was using the same syringe, I'd be drawing water out of there and potentially drawing with it Mahano anemone spores, which I would then dip into my new saltwater reservoir and potentially contaminate it, which might lead to Mahano anemones in my main tank. Pretty slim chance of that happening, but I really don't want to risk it, so two syringes it is. Now I don't really plan on doing fixed weekly water changes. Instead what I want to do is do 10% water changes pretty much as often as I can. So anytime I get a few seconds, I turn around and see the tank and think, hey, why don't I do a water change? I'll do it straight away. And that should hopefully keep the water nice and new and keep any nasties from building up. The next thing I need to think about in terms of maintenance is of course clearing the glass. Now actually if you look closely there is already a little bit of algae on the glass, and this thing's only been running for about 2 weeks. And that of course is because conditions that suit Mahano anemones also suit algae. Now the smallest algae scraper I have is the Tunzi Nano, but that is about half the size of the tank, so obviously that's out. So what I've had to do, for now anyway, is fashion my own algae scraper. And here it is. This is one of the little plastic pieces that you're supposed to put in the plumbing, but that I found restricted the plumbing that comes with the tank. And what I've done is I've covered the end with a bit of kitchen roll. So for now, this should allow me to get down the side of the glass, in front of the glass, the acrylic, in front of the rock, because there's really not a lot of space, and give it a bit of a clean. Now I'm not sure if this is going to work long term, so I might need to figure out an alternative solution, but let's have a look how it works. So to do this then, I have turned off the water flow, and I'm just going to get my little tool. Look at that. Oh wow, it's even going brown already. Seems to be working all right. Now, for now at least, the algae isn't really bedded in and it's not really hard on the surface. So it's not like I've got coralline algae to scrape off. That would be an absolute nightmare. However, the longer you leave it between scraping algae, the harder the stuff gets. So I am going to have to do this very often, otherwise it's going to be a pain in the backside. But there you go, that's it. What was that? 5-10 seconds and the tank was scraped of algae. Pretty good going. And now that is pretty much everything done in terms of maintenance, but the last issue I'm going to struggle with is dealing with algae. Now I can't put anything in there to eat the algae, obviously there's no space for fish. Can you imagine the tang police if I put a yellow tang in there? And in terms of cleanup crew, I might be tempted to put something like an Asterina starfish in, or maybe some kind of Stomatella snail, something like that. But I do wonder if they'd be okay in a tank with basically zero stability. Now to be fair, at the moment you do have to look pretty close to see any algae because the bits are tiny, but it very much is there, and there are even the photosynthetic bubbles that tell me I have algae and possibly even dinoflagellates, who knows. Now what I think I'm going to have to do with that is just let it be and maybe scrub it with a bit of hydrogen peroxide and a toothbrush if it gets out of control. But there's not really an easy fix for algae on a tank like this, so what I'm really hoping is that water changes do the trick and keep nutrients down to a minimum, bearing in mind of course I'm not going to be feeding. So there you have it then, that is all the mods I've made on this tank and the maintenance I'm likely to do to keep it running smoothly. Now ideally I'd really like this tank to look after itself, because the last thing I need is to do more maintenance, given I already have 2 other tanks. But ultimately I do want this tank to be a success long term, so I am prepared to put a little bit of elbow grease in to make that happen. If you've got any questions then let me know in the comment section below, and if you enjoyed the video give me a thumbs up and subscribe for next week, and until next time, Happy reefing.